My name is Dr. Donna Roberts, and this presentation is about the psychology of advertising, conscious and unconscious determinants of consumer behavior. In the competitive and cluttered environment of today's commercial marketplace, the average American is inundated with between 3,000 and 5,000 advertising messages per day in various forms, and yet considers their effect inconsequential. Advertisers, however, understand the persuasive power their communication can have upon consumer behavior, and thus attempt to make such a lasting impression that their distinct message will positively influence the purchase decision. Regarding this influence of advertising, in the most direct and simplistic model, consumers see a commercial or print ad that creates or modifies their perceptions of the brand, and as a result, they are more likely to purchase the brand. However, a more likely, albeit less direct conceptualization of the process posits that consumers absorb some impression of interpretation from the ad, perhaps without conscious attention, which is then referenced, again, perhaps even unconsciously, at the time of purchase decision. Consider this. What comes to mind when you see or hear this word? In ancient Greek religion, Nike was a goddess who personified victory. But I suspect that is not what first came to mind for most people. Instead, you probably thought of this. Nike is an American multinational corporation that is engaged in the design, development, manufacturing, and worldwide marketing of sales of footwear, apparel, equipment, accessories, and services. That association, that split-second recognition of this word as a sports company, is a direct result of the advertising you have been exposed to. Furthermore, many of you would also make the same connection upon seeing the familiar logo. Beyond simple recognition, you might also have experienced some level of an emotional response or a judgment, positive or negative, depending upon your beliefs, values, and experiences. Before advertising, this symbol was neutral. Consider these as well. What do they make you think of? How do they make you feel? Can you turn it off? Can you not make the respective association? Love them or hate them, you will probably recognize, categorize, and judge most of them. Consumer behavior is one of the most pervasive of human behaviors. Virtually every individual is a consumer at some level, and aspects of consumer behavior occur daily in the lives of most people. Since human beings spend much of their lives consuming products and services, from houses, food and clothing, to transportation, health, and recreational services, it follows that consumer behavior represents an integral part of human behavior and cannot be fully separated or considered distinct from general human functioning. Far from being a passive mirror of society or reflection of an already established consumer need, advertising exerts influence that is cumulative, often subtle, and at least partially unconscious. Advertising is everywhere in the modern environment, on radio, television, and computers, in magazines and newspapers, on billboards, on buildings, on public transportation, on the clothing, shoes, and accessories of sports and entertainment figures, and strategically placed in films, television shows, and websites. Advertisers spend millions of dollars every day in order to persuade their targets to want and then to buy their products and services by crafting persuasive messages that appeal to one's basic needs. While it is generally accepted that these advertising efforts influence consumer behavior, the specific mechanisms whereby this is achieved are still not fully understood. In an age fraught with economic uncertainty, skyrocketing consumer debt, materialism, unemployment, and foreclosures, a better understanding of the individual characteristics that influence consumer behavior can be considered an important factor in enhancing overall psychological health and well-being. Moreover, understanding psychological triggers has long been an aspect of various behavior modification and counseling interventions. Reviewing experimental inquiries over the last 30 years, Zee and Bush concluded that extant research has documented that consumers can be highly susceptible to deceptive advertising claims that lead them to acquire false information, form misperceptions, and become involved in consumptive behaviors to their detriment. In the context of advertising, consumer susceptibility refers to the extent to which individuals attend to and value commercial messages as sources of information for guiding their consumptive behaviors, and is related to the concept of consumer vulnerability and influenceability. Consumer susceptibility to advertising has been a prominent area of study since the 1980s. Specifically, psychologists have argued that advertisements advocate violence and are responsible for a breakdown in early learning skills and the destruction of parental authority. In other studies, advertising has been correlated with increased obesity, promiscuous sexual behavior, negative body image, and glamorization of drug, alcohol, and tobacco use. Together, this research suggests that high susceptibility results from interactions among the content of advertising claims, situational context, and consumer characteristics, that is, the individual differences in response to advertising. As consumers, the best defense against the adverse effects of incessant onslaught of advertising messages is to be cognizant of the messages and the ways in which one is vulnerable to them. Researchers and practitioners both have long theorized a link between psychology and consumer behavior. As early as 1950, M.S. Hatwick, psychologist and account executive for a major advertising agency, published a book titled How to Use Psychology for Better Advertising. Likewise, advertising mogul David Ogilvy argued for the necessity of understanding consumers in order to execute advertisement that would be successful in persuading them to buy a specific brand. Since then, the application of principles of personality to explain aspects of consumer behavior has been extensive, but not systematic. While some of the early studies indicated potential for explaining and predicting certain consumer behaviors via personality traits, much of the research instead has been criticized for falling short of this goal. Specifically, the history of the study of the application of psychological principles to market studies has been characterized by practitioners applying concepts indiscriminately in an attempt to increase market effectiveness, particularly with respect to specific campaigns. Thus, the interest in this approach waned somewhat for a time, as it became clear that there was not one proverbial psychological magic bullet that can be applied to effectively persuade a population toward a desired purchasing behavior. Consumer behavior encompasses conduct along a broad spectrum, ranging from a detailed and extensive process of information search, brand comparison, and product evaluation to incidental impulse purchases. A study of consumer behavior is built upon analyzing patterns or constructs that interpret, conceptualize, and predict events. These patterns or constructs differ from individual to individual based upon differences in personality and associated lifestyles. Researchers analyze market segments to ascertain the extent of influence that a broad personality characteristic or a combination of characteristics exerts on the behavior of individual consumers in that particular segment. Market research has indicated that different products and services and the corresponding benefits they provide tend to appeal to different people as a direct function of their personalities. When targeting segments that display a particular personality trait, marketers attempt to develop campaigns that effectively communicate the benefits of the products that will be particularly meaningful to or responded to by a particular group. Thus, by understanding the relationship between the personality tendencies of consumers and their purchase behavior, marketers are better equipped to target and promote their products effectively. That is, to exercise a means of manipulative persuasion. Advertisers and advertising, as a part of a broader marketing effort, attempt to influence consumer behavior by persuading potential customers that their product or services meets, or at times creates, identified needs. Most consumers, however, are not aware of the extent to which advertising influences their taste and manipulates their desires with the sole aim of making the target product a deeply and urgently desired commodity. According to advertising guru David Ogilvy, consumers will buy products whose advertising promises them value for money, beauty, nutrition, relief from suffering, social status, and so on. Further, he continues, when faced with selling parody products, all you can do is explain their virtues more persuasively than your competitors, and to differentiate them by the style of your advertising. While most people think that advertising has little or no influence on them, considering it merely incidental filler, the companies marketing their brands and the agencies controlling the means to do so consider advertising the most important aspect of mass media, above the programming and feature articles. Total advertising expenditure in 2017 was approximately $183 billion in the United States and $591 billion worldwide. Advertising subsidizes more than 60% of print production, newspaper and magazine, and virtually 100% of electronic media, television, radio, and internet. In the Sunday edition of the New York Times, the consumer may encounter as many as 350 pages of advertisements. Approximately 1 of every 4 minutes in primetime television is now a commercial message, with some networks allowing up to 20 minutes of non-programming every hour. Some radio stations devote 40 minutes of every hour to commercials. In reality, the featured programming highlighted to the consumer represents filler for the time between sponsored commercials rather than vice versa. Furthermore, the programming that succeeds, as measured in terms of remaining on the seasonal schedule, is not that which is most widely popular, but rather that which delivers the highest number of the defined target market to the advertisers and thus can command higher advertising rates. Kilborn notes, newspapers are more in the business of selling audiences than in the business of giving people news, and magazines are essentially catalogs of goods, with less than half their pages devoted to editorial content, and much of that in the service of the advertisers. Furthermore, advertising's influence on media content is exerted in 2 major ways: via the suppression of information that would harm or offend the sponsor, and/or the inclusion of editorial content that is advertiser-friendly and creates an environment in which the ad looks good and is appealing to consumers. All this is done in a concentrated and focused effort to find the distinctive hook that will effectively persuade the individual to first desire a specific state of being, and then subsequently to purchase a particular product that holds the promise of delivering that contrived result. The measurement of advertising effectiveness. In the realm of consumer behavior research, a successful advertisement must accomplish 4 basic tasks. 1. Exposure. The consumer must come in contact with the ad message. 2. Attention. The consumer must have a thoughtful awareness and consideration of the content. 3. Interpretation. The ad must be accurately understood. And 4. Memory. The ad must be retained in memory in a manner that will allow retrieval under the proper circumstances. Following this model, advertising has a long history of quantifying effectiveness in relation to memory of a specific ad, advertising campaign, or advertised brand. Various widely accepted theories, including day-after recall, the awareness, interest, desire, action model, and defining advertising goals for measured advertising results models, are based on the fundamental argument that an ad's memorability, that is, its ability to sufficiently intrude into a consumer's consciousness, is measured by degree of recognition. Specifically, the majority of advertisement testing measures are based on the assumption that when consumers make purchase decisions, they attempt to recall advertising for brands in the relevant category, as well as other brand knowledge. To the extent to which this search for advertising information is successful is thought to determine how well advertising messages have been attended to and learned. Thus, the measure most often used to assess advertising effectiveness is verbatim recall of the message content. This measure is referred to as an explicit measure of memory because it reflects the extent to which people retrieve the content of an explicit message. While there is little dispute that familiarity with the advertising content is a useful indicator of the extent to which the message has been learned, interpreting the impact of advertising, that is, the subsequent and/or corresponding purchase decision, from a measure of explicit ad recognition can be more complex and problematic. While advertisers base their whole operation on the premise that the right advertising message will help promote sales, Ogilvy, citing specific campaigns and associated sales figures, argued the converse, namely that advertising that sends the wrong message can actually decrease sales. In other words, he argued against the premise that any and all advertising would increase sales, and instead proposed that the message must be carefully and precisely crafted. Specifically, he proposed that advertisers, in order to create an effective ad, must research the consumers and find out how they think, what language they use, what attributes are important to them, and what promise would be most likely to make them buy your brand. Personality and consumer research. The study of personality in relation to consumer behavior seeks to determine and describe the relative influence of individual characteristics on consumers' response to products, packaging, advertising, and the decision process. Despite the widespread use of demographics in consumer research, some research have emphasized the efficacy of personality constructs for predicting and explaining differences in response to advertising over the use of demographic data or purchasing behavior. Demographics lack the precision and specificity of psychometric-oriented tests with regard to the cognitive processes that are incorporated into the consumer decision-making process. Much of the existing consumer-related personality research was conducted from the 1950s through the 1980s and focused on identifying specific personality characteristics to explain differences in consumers' purchase, use, and disposition patterns. This early research, which used general personality measures to explain and predict broad aspects of consumer behavior, proved largely disappointing and inconclusive. However, a number of studies sported a significant relationship between personality traits and susceptibility to influence, and with several focused specifically on personality and the efficacy of advertising. One of the earliest attempts to distinguish brand preferences on the basis of personality variables was the research conducted by Evans, in which he studied a sample of 71 Ford owners and 69 Chevrolet owners. The subjects were administered the Edwards Personality Preference Schedule, which was designed to measure 11 psychological needs: achievement, deference, exhibition, autonomy, affiliation, introception, dominance, abasement, change, aggression, and heterosexuality. Following a thorough analysis of the findings, Evans concluded that the personality needs measured by this instrument were of little value in predicting whether an individual would own a Ford or a Chevrolet. Approximately 3 years after the Evans study, Westphal conducted research that again attempted to relate automobile ownership to individual personality variables. Rather than using specific brands, he attempted to distinguish among owners of types of autos, that is, convertible, compact, and standard models. Westphal used the Thurstone Temperament Schedule to measure 7 personality characteristics: active, vigorous, impulsive, dominant, stable, sociable, and reflective, of a sample of 231 males in metropolitan areas. Additionally, he analyzed ownership of Fords and Chevrolets. While his results indicated no significant differences in the personality measures of the Ford and Chevrolet owners, thus supporting Evans' findings, the research did suggest certain personality characteristics were related to the type of car owned. Much of the lack of success in predicting product or brand use from personality measures has been attributed to several methodological problems, including small samples and inadequate sampling procedures. Additionally, the conditions under which researchers administered the personality measures were often poorly controlled, and thus a variety of factors related to the experimental situation may have influenced the respondents. Furthermore, the early studies often gave inadequate consideration to situational factors such as price, availability, and the influence of other family members in determining the purchase of products studied. The related lifestyle segmentation methodologies have also been heavily criticized. In a general sense, the central concepts of lifestyle, psychographics, and activities, interest, and opinions research, while intuitively attractive, tends to be ill-defined. Additionally, when these tools are employed, it is often unclear why particular segments indicated particular consumer preferences, rendering predictions of emerging patterns difficult to identify and pinpoint. Furthermore, current lifestyle measures do not tend to easily reflect the fluidity of segment membership. As such, these concepts are often criticized for engaging in circular reasoning. While the standard established psychological measurements for personality have been criticized as being too clinical for the practical application of analyzing consumer behavior, additional criticisms emerge based on the commercial nature of many of the alternate segmentation typology schemes, such as VALS, Mosaic, Prism, and Acorn. As such, often the methodology for the development and testing of the systems is considered proprietary information and thus not released for review. Often, information about the classification system beyond basic descriptions is not available, primarily because the marketing companies charge their customers for their segmentation analysis. This means that very little independent research exists examining the validity and/or reliability of these measures, or for verifying correlations between lifestyle segments and particular behaviors such as brand choice. Therefore, while lifestyle variables are most likely relevant to various aspects of consumer behavior, one cannot be certain whether the true essence of this relationship has been captured with the measures currently available. That is, whether these measures possess adequate validity. Similarly, other research found that significant relationships between personality and aspects of consumer behavior, thus rendering support of the claim that consumers have brand preferences that cannot be accounted for by the negligible differences that may exist among competing brands of parity products. Horton examined the effects of 6 personality characteristics on consumer decision-making. His results indicated that personality characteristics appeared to be related to the use of differing choice categories in some product classes. Sparks and Tucker found emotional stability, irresponsibility, sociability, and lack of cautiousness are related to early adopter behavior in categories of fashion products. Bell found that consumers low in self-confidence tended to defer to others for purchase decisions, a finding that was replicated later by First, Punj, and Stewart. Punj and Stewart reviewed several additional studies that have identified relationships between consumer behavior and personality. Mazes and Sweeney concluded that tolerance for ambiguity was positively correlated with a willingness to purchase substitute low-cost convenience items, and inversely correlated with the willingness to purchase substitute durable goods. Others found that consumers who were more tolerant of ambiguity and higher in self-esteem tended to use more product information and examine more alternatives. Summary, findings, and conclusions. As evidenced by the more than 300 studies examined by Khasadjian and Sheffitt, personality has long been theorized to influence aspects of consumer behavior. A number of studies sported a significant relationship between personality traits and susceptibility to influence and persuasion, with several focused specifically on personality and the efficacy of advertising. However, despite this intuitive assumption, the nature and origin of the relationship has proven rather elusive and ambiguous. The failure to generate support for the intuitively logical assumption that individual personality differences influence consumer-related behavior has largely been attributed to the lack of focus and specificity in the nature of the factors examined. Early on, Percy argued that the research yielded inconclusive results because of serious methodology problems and a piecemeal approach. Somewhat later, Runyon and Stewart still criticized the research attempt as disjointed and in need of cohesive synthesis. Equivocal results have been the status quo for decades of research linking personality to consumer behavior. Despite efforts of researchers to refine and fine-tune measurements, methodologies, and procedures, results have provided few direct links between variables that comprise these complex constructs. Practical implications and limitations. The challenge in human behavior research is to tease out and separate these combinations with distinct specificity in order to better understand the triggers of influence. Thus, results which fail to strongly and clearly identify theorized contributing factors as precursors to specific behaviors can serve to help eliminate these factors and redirect further research. New research should attempt to isolate even more distinct component aspects of consumer behavior and more precisely defined variables that is, psychological precursors to actual purchasing behavior and specific brand selection. There is a need for a context-relevant instrument, or series of instruments, that measure not only personality traits or types, but also situational factors, abilities, and motivation in order to predict performance in a certain field. The paradox remains. We need at once both a holistic and comprehensive measure for this multifaceted behavior, yet one without confounding variables that interfere with each other and produce ambiguous results. Perhaps the future approach is best captured by the iconic slogan of Apple, "Think different." In conclusion, while advertising may seem on the surface as a frivolous and superficial area of study, we must remember that these images have a reciprocal influence on us both as individuals and as the larger society. In many ways, the images we are exposed to over 3,000 times each day set the standards for beauty, success, and happiness, standards that are all too often impossible to reach, contrived and superficial, but nonetheless can affect such issues as self-esteem and self-concept. For this reason alone, the effects of advertising merit our study and attention. Thank you.